So far in this class, we talked about some of the foundations of human wealth, such as labor, agriculture, or subsistence production. Today, we will go deeper still and explore the base of the substantive economy, our non-human environment, or nature. Every bit of wealth that we produce originates in it, be it the food we eat, the air we breathe, the houses we live in, our smartphones, everything. Less than 1% of the United States GDP derives directly from resource extraction. But using the perspective of the substantive economy, we know this is only half of the story. First, we consume products whose resource base is abroad. While the actual extraction of, say, coltan might add to the GDP of Rwanda or Brazil, the mineral still ends up in our smartphones here in the US. But when we think of the contributions of natural resources to an economy, extraction is only the first step. After materials are sourced, they are processed in various ways of manufacturing, they are traded, each step adding additional value. The low share of resource extraction to the United States GNP fools us to believe that we have divested our economy from resource extraction. But almost everything we do is linked to a material base stemming from nature. Imagine a day without electricity, which is generated from natural resources. The economy and social life as we know it would come to a halt immediately. And when you consider soil fertility and clean water as natural resources, it becomes clear why the entire substantive economy rests on our non-human environment. If natural resources contribute to human wealth, then why don't we extract as much as we can? Drill, baby, drill was a Republican slogan in the 2008 presidential election that expressed that stance. Well, let's consider resource economics. Extracting resources requires some initial investment, and sometimes the costs to extract a resource are higher than its value. Up into the 19th century, the US were considered mineral poor, because the known mineral reserves were too difficult to access. That changed with innovations in mining and drilling that lowered the extraction cost and made more resources available. We see this today with hydraulic fracturing of natural gas, aka fracking. The gas reserves in the Marcellus Shale in western Pennsylvania were known since the 19th century, but only innovations in hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling made tapping into these resources worthwhile. There's also the question of sustainability. Every non-renewable resource will eventually run out or become too expensive to extract. Should we use these resources now, or should we save them for future generations? Or simply leave them in the ground forever? If you inherited $10,000 today, are you going to spend it right away, or will you save it for later? This is a question of personal preference that only you can answer. Some of you may say, well, if I inherited $10,000 today, I would invest it so that it can grow over time. And that's one argument in favor of aggressive resource extraction. If we make money today by extracting oil and natural gas, we can invest it into renewable energies that will provide sustainable energy for generations to come. And while that may theoretically work for energy, it won't for non-substitutable resources. If you need helium for a certain chemical process, for instance, but there's nothing left, well, then you're stuck. Optimists hope we'll always develop new technologies and processes that allow us to find solutions to these problems. But how do we know? There's no logical or empirical basis for this assumption. We need more solid evidence to solve our problems than religious belief in human ingenuity. One resource that is becoming scarce already is our planet's capacity to absorb pollution. Yes, we could use income from oil and gas to invest in renewable energies, but if meanwhile the emitted carbon dioxide accelerates climate change to the point of widespread global catastrophe, new wind turbines are our least concern. Or when an oil spill contaminates our drinking water, we also have more immediate problems than potential future investments. Only 2 years after the 2008 presidential elections, the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig in the Gulf of Mexico exploded and caused one of the biggest environmental disasters of US history. It didn't take long until pundits changed the slogan "Drill, baby, drill" to "Spill, baby, spill," and eventually "Kill, baby, kill." So far, we have looked at natural resources from an economic perspective. It becomes sociological when we realize that both the benefits and the burdens of resource extraction and consumption are not equally distributed. Generally speaking, under capitalism, the profits of resource extraction go to already capital-rich investors, whereas the burdens tend to fall onto marginalized populations. Corporations invest into resources because they make money by first buying the resource below its actual value and then having the public and vulnerable populations pay for the damages. In economics, burdens that are outsourced to a third party are called externalities, and they constitute a profit margin that companies can tap into. From their perspective, this is a lucrative business model. From the perspective of the public, however, two forms of dispossession are at play. How did we call the transformation of a common good, such as a natural resource, into a private commodity? Right, primitive accumulation, or accumulation by dispossession. If the same company then creates environmental damages at the expense of the public, the company again appropriates a public resource, such as public health and environmental health, for its profits. That is why resource companies and the investors lobby against environmental regulations. Each regulation is essentially a decision over who has to pay for the externalities of an extraction or manufacturing process. If the EPA mandates factories and power stations to install new filters in their stacks, they are requiring these companies to bear some of the cost that otherwise the public would pay in environmental damages and poor health. So far, I have portrayed resource extraction as something from which only capitalists profit. But in democratic countries like the United States, we expect that local communities also benefit from resource extraction, for example through the creation of jobs, royalties, and local tax revenue. Those benefits generally occur, but they don't always compensate for the damages a community suffers. The Appalachian coal country is a perfect example. During the peak of coal mining, there was widespread employment. Miners were proud of their work, and there was a sense that the whole community benefited from mining, although the workers knew that the mine operators were benefiting of the health of their workers. Yet, as coal mining declined in Appalachia, it became clear that the wealth that stayed in the community wasn't enough to diversify the economy. And now former mining counties in the region are experiencing some of the most persistent poverty in the country, and environmental damages that have not been cleaned up. Sociologists describe a three-phase boom and bust cycle that resource-dependent communities often fall into. If a resource is discovered and people decide to exploit it, there's an initial build-up of infrastructure, which provides temporary jobs in construction and local services. Then there's an operational phase, in which the resource is extracted. Unless the specific extraction process is very labor-intensive, the labor demand declines, but there's still a steady flow of revenue into the community. This ends, however, with the bust cycle, when the resource is depleted and operations are shut down. During the bust phase, the local communities are often left with cleaning up environmental damages and oversized infrastructure that they no longer need. In this phase, unemployment, social disintegration, and outmigration usually increase significantly. Geographer Stephen White proposed the concept of eternal colonialism, or internal colonial dependency, to describe this dynamic. White argues that in most cases, elites in metropolitan centers provide the capital to extract resources in the periphery. Lacking other opportunities to make a living, many people in the rural periphery accept these investments for the jobs they provide, no matter how exploitive. Since the rural communities do not have the capacity to negotiate better terms, they accept arrangements with the investors in which most of the wealth sourced from the resources flow away from the community. In the context of Appalachia, political scientist John Gaventa spoke fittingly of the quiescence of rural peoples that quietly accept their domination by capitalist companies simply because they perceive them as overwhelming powers that they cannot resist. When North American companies are mining resources overseas with American capital, neocolonialism is an appropriate term. In the Marcellus Shale region of western Pennsylvania, which is currently experiencing a natural gas boom, there's a fierce debate whether the local benefits are worth the trouble even during the boom time. Yes, there is income generated and temporary jobs, but there are also externalities like increased traffic, wear and tear on local roads, and chemicals that leak into aquifers. Whether the benefits outweigh the costs depends on individual perspective. The sociological view reminds us not to commit the fallacy of equating the averages of a community with the well-being of individuals. The term community obscures deep inequalities in terms of who is benefiting and who is suffering from certain developments. For example, landowners who receive direct payments if a gas well is constructed on their property are more likely to support fracking than landowners nearby that don't receive those royalties, but who depend on the same aquifer or drive on the same crowded roads. We also know that environmental burdens are rarely evenly distributed. Over and over, environmental sociologists find that locally unwanted land uses, such as Superfund sites or oil refineries, are predominantly sited in areas inhabited by poorer communities, in particular communities with larger shares of people of color. Sociologist Bullard popularized the term environmental racism to describe this practice. I assigned you an interview with Bullard in which he discusses how environmental pollution often falls along race and class lines. This is all to say that questions of resource development are questions of social justice. Accordingly, the history of industrial capitalism is also a history of calls for environmental justice, calls that environmental damages should be proportional to the benefits derived from environmentally hazardous land uses and resource extraction. So far, I've mostly talked about environmentally destructive industries and energy sources. The Brown and Schaft chapter on natural resources provides a series of examples of technologies that are comparatively less destructive, such as wind and solar power. These technologies also have the added benefit that they can be scaled down to be more affordable. Only wealthy investors can finance a coal power plant or a mine, and so much of the revenue flows away from the communities in which it is generated, and local control over the process is low. Wind turbines or solar panels, however, can often be financed by local communities, collectives, or private landowners. In consequence, these technologies promise less environmental disturbance and a more equitable distribution of their revenue and costs. But despite these advantages, let's not forget that everything has a price. Solar panels require non-renewable minerals that are often mined under questionable environmental and labor conditions in developing countries. Mega dams across the world, although using water as a renewable energy, routinely flood the territories and villages of indigenous peoples and peasants. In a world in which many resources are already past the peak of their extraction and many environmental damages have incurred, we need to find ways to live good lives on a smaller resource base. More efficient processes and technologies are one way of achieving this. If your new car uses half as much gas as your old one, you're doing the environment a favor, right? Theoretically, yes, but in practice, the marginal benefits of more efficient processes are often offset by increased consumption. This is known as the rebound effect. Economists have found that when more fuel-efficient cars enter the market, people respond by driving more and longer distances, instead of reducing their fuel consumption. So, technological innovations are important, but cannot alone solve the problem of dwindling and strained resources. We also need to question our consumption habits. What are the things we need, and what can we do without? How can we organize social life that more needs can be taken care of with less consumption of material goods? There's no evidence that more consumption generally leads to more happiness once subsistence needs are met. Anthropologists struggle to find any evidence that people in high consumption societies like the United States are any happier than, say, hunter-gatherer societies in intact environments. What people think they need beyond the essentials of survival is a cultural question. In developed countries, we often think that increased consumption signals social status, and so we compete against each other about who has the biggest house, the biggest car, or if you're a farmer, the biggest tractor. But from looking at other cultures, we know that none of this is essential to what it means to be human, or to be happy, and cultural norms can change. What is changing already is the way many of us look at the environment. Drawing from the knowledge of indigenous peoples, peasants, and women, there's an increasing push to rethink our place in the web of life. Western patriarchal ideology has it that man is the master of everything, and the environment is up for grabs. But as we recognize that even men are vulnerable to what happens in the natural world, and that other beings also have a right for a dignified existence, this view is no longer acceptable. That is why environmental humanists recommend moving away from the term natural resources, which implies that the whole purpose of these non-human beings is to be appropriated by humans. If we recognize them as having their independent right to exist, using a term like non-human environment captures the sentiment better. To conclude, our non-human environment is the foundation of the substantive economy. We cannot live without drawing from the environment, but we also cannot live if we destroy it. Just how we use materials from the natural environment to satisfy our needs is a deeply sociological question. We must ask, how are these materials and the benefits that flow from them distributed among the population? Can all people satisfy their material needs, or does ownership over capital justify privileged access? Do local communities benefit from mining, drilling, or logging as much as external investors do? But environmental justice is not just a question of the distribution of benefits, who gets what, but also a question of distributing environmental and social costs of potentially harmful land uses. So, what materials are being sourced and under what conditions is not simply a technical or economic issue, but also a matter of ethical choices. Finally, I urge you to question why we are using materials from the non-human environment in the first place. What materials do we need so desperately to justify a burden on other beings? And what is excess? What rights do the earth, animals, plants, water, the atmosphere, and other people have to exist without pollution? These are ethical questions that I cannot answer for you, but environmental sociology urges us to confront these questions.